Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Onchain Alpha, a weekly podcast where we explore the world of on-chain data together with the people who are building the infrastructure, applications, products, and writing your favorite threads on Twitter and now Farcaster. Make sure to sign up to our newsletter at cryptosapiens.xyz. Today, we're talking to Carl, previously with Hypercerts, now building the open source observer. Carl, we've done the intro. We've talked a little bit. We've warmed up. First of all, give us an introduction, because I'm sure that doesn't give enough of an introduction about who you are, how you got into the space, how you started Hypercerts, and why you're now building open source observer.
Great. Well, first off, it's awesome to be here, Humpty. Big fan of the show. I've enjoyed seeing other people that are working in the regen data space come on. So it's a real privilege to have that opportunity myself. I've always been a person who's been interested in data, but then looked for places where you can actually use it and derive meaning from it and apply that data in some context. So before getting into crypto, and actually even before getting into software type work, I was involved very much in the real world, in the meat space, doing coffee supply chain work. So I spent a lot of time living abroad in East Africa, helping groups of farmer cooperatives come together, put in place accounting and finance systems, and then basically elect leaders and do governance work, and then ultimately try and process their coffee, export it, get financing for it. Over time, employ different standards that would help them improve on sustainability metrics, on profitability metrics, et cetera. And so a lot of my work, even back in the day, was focused on getting good data that allow farmers or cooperatives to benchmark their performance and set their own goals and try and improve. And obviously, that's very relevant to what we're trying to do right now, both at Open Source Observer, and then in general in the space, where we don't really have good ways of tracking impact. We don't really have a set of norms or standards around here are the domains of impact we want to see more of. We're trying to make this up right now. We're trying to figure it out. The amazing blessing we have is that all of this work is happening out in the open. And so before getting into crypto, I was running a Web2 startup that was helping coffee companies analyze their supply chain, identify key risks around sustainability issues. It could be deforestation, it could be child labor, it could be the prices that producers were getting. And so we had this massive, unbelievable data set, but it was all kind of locked up in this walled garden. And so companies would effectively use that to identify areas that they can improve, and they design programs, but there wasn't any way of coordinating multiple actors. So if there are two companies that wanted to work in the same area, there was really no mechanism for them to agree on who was going to do what and come up with a shared plan. At the same time, there was no desire to pool funding towards the same goals. And the farmers, the people that were most impacted by this work, they really had no say. They had no governance voice in what was happening and how the data was being used. So those things, I was working on that up until around 2022 or so, and then increasingly spending nights and weekends getting involved in crypto. So for me, one of the ecosystems that I gravitated to naturally was Gitcoin, both because it was very much at this intersection of public goods and trying to have real world impact, and also because the data sets were very, very fascinating. So Gitcoin has this really interesting problem with Sybil attacks, where people are coming in and trying to influence the voting outcomes by pretending to be more than one person. It's if you're in the crypto space, it's a well documented problem. And Gitcoin is a great place to see Sybil attacks in the real world. And so I was kind of drawn to that problem. Said, okay, how can we identify a web of trust? How can we identify signals of high quality users and kind of map that across a network? And so that's a really fun, data challenge that I was kind of doing nights and weekends. That got me deeper and deeper into the Gitcoin and the public goods in Ethereum ecosystem. From there was basically a request that Owaki put out, co-authored with people from Protocol Labs, saying we need impact certificates. We need some way of verifying that these claims that people are making are credible. And ideally, over time, you can have some kind of a marketplace for those claims. So let's say I care about impact in this area. I might be able to create a demand signal. And if people are able to deliver that kind of impact, then I will be a buyer for that. So in the same way that you have this for carbon credits right now, you could, in theory, have that for any kind of impact factor. It could be bring me more developers, bring me more good users, solve this security risk, et cetera. But that was like the basic call to adventure. So I remember seeing that, and then coming out of that was the idea that there's a range of different ideas that were put out there, and Hypercerts was the one that they decided to work on and put resources towards. So I said, okay, like I'm fascinated by this problem. I also have a lot of respect for the work that Gitcoin and Protocol Labs have done in driving the space forward. There was an opportunity to join the Hypercerts team early on. So I was able to join at the time that Holka Brahmer was the leading person in the community driving the Hypercerts work forward. There was some research that was done by Davidad prior to him, but then he kind of picked it up and got things going. We had a small developer team with Raid Guild that was working on building the first protocol and the first interface for using Hypercerts. And then Raymond Chang, he joined around the same time as I did as well. And he was supposed to be working on another project, but he kind of was nerd sniped by the problem of Hypercerts. And so he said, actually, this is like a really interesting thing to work on. Let's do it. And so this is now like 2023, small 3-person team working on Hypercerts. At that point, the protocol didn't exist. There were no use cases. There was basically just a white paper. And so we had to do the discovery work of figuring out what would be the first use case. How do we get this going? How do we ship the protocol? How do we get people using it? And then from there, what is the community going to want to do next? So that was kind of what a lot of 2023 was focused on. In doing that work, we were always looking for use cases. Like it's nice, and crypto has this problem where you can have a beautiful vision for what the world is going to look like, but then you don't have any users, and you just have a fancy mechanism, but it's not actually having any impact because no one is using it. And so we were like desperate for finding the best use cases for Hypercerts. And in order to have a good use case, you need to have some kind of a functioning impact market that has to exist. In theory, it's not that difficult to get projects to show up, but to find funders who are willing to fund things retrospectively or retroactively, that's a harder problem. Most people are very comfortable saying, we will give you money only if you do these things, as opposed to, we're going to look back at all the things that you've done and then give you money, which is kind of like critical for an impact market to work. And so as you're probably, as it might be foreshadowing, the only game in town at that point was basically Optimism. So they had this mechanism called retroactive public goods funding, where they will look across the ecosystem every 6 months or so and say, we're going to give money with no strings attached to anybody who's had impact. And so we said, great, like that's a really good place to focus. Let's start analyzing the data about the type of work that is happening there. And that kind of led us to, it started out as basically like a hackathon project, but saying, okay, if we were to look at these projects that are in the Optimism ecosystem, how might we measure and get some data in the loop so that people can make better decisions about which ones have had more impact? That was like what began as a hackathon project led to Open Source Observer. And now that's what we're working on full time.
Well, that was a very thorough introduction. I wouldn't expect anything less from you, Carl. So there's a lot. I mean, I'm taking notes here because I wanted to make sure I went back to a couple of things that you mentioned.
Yeah, sure.
First of all, and probably one of the things that's most important about the space that we're talking about is open source funding.
Right.
So a lot of what I know about, the traditional open source funding, and I guess the open source funding that Web3 enables, it comes from Kevin Owocki, which I think we both can agree has written a lot on the matter. The guy is a prolific writer. Tell me, if from your personal experience, what are some things that you've seen having come from that space previously and coming into Web3 as being the biggest influencers to how open source funding can be different in a world powered by Web3?
Right. One of the things that I think is very powerful and should not be taken for granted is that there's a culture that has emerged around funding public goods. So I think that I wasn't around at this time, but my sense is that in like the early days of Web 1, there was also like a similar culture, which is that we're interdependent. We need to work together. We need to fund certain things. I think there was much more of an instinct that instead of creating a company, you might want to create a protocol, and that would be a way of getting adoption and so on. Obviously, we lost our way in Web 2 in the sense that the idea of working and producing open source software and there being a need to support each other and have interdependent funding and community support and so on, we kind of lost sight of that. And I think what's really powerful in Web3 right now is that everywhere you look, I guess particularly within the Ethereum ecosystem, but even outside of that, there's a recognition that all this work is kind of on the shoulders of someone who came before us. So in Ethereum, it's like citing the influence of the Bitcoin white paper and work that had been done prior to Ethereum. All of the layer 2s that are now popping up on Ethereum, they recognize the importance of having Ethereum as a globally secure, censorship-resistant settlement layer. And as a result of that, I think we're very fortunate that the idea that we need to fund these things, that we need to sustain these things, and we need to come up with new models for doing that is kind of built in right now. And so we're not having the debate, do these things matter? We're at the phase where we're experimenting on what are the best ways of doing it, and how do you fund things on a recurring basis? How do you get people to pool funding together? How do you make it so that it's easy? How do you make it so that you're able to go not just to the things that you know about, but upstream of that, the things that might be under the radar? Those are all really good problems to have once you have committed to funding things. And I think we're past that point. Like, people are committed to funding public goods, and now we have to get better at funding the right ones.
That's such a marvelous statement, and I agree. I think we've built a good system. I think we need more systems, but I think we've built a few good systems that are facilitating funding. I think you mentioned one, which is Optimism, and I'm a huge fan, and also a recipient for Crypto Sapiens through RPGF 3, one of the latest ones.
Yeah.
So I understand that very well. I wonder if you could do me a favor here, because I know obviously you weren't around during that time, and neither was I. But from my understanding, previous open source work, and let's call it like protocol work for the internet, seemed to have been funded by the government, right? And I think the government was very influential in the internet just being possible. What do you think is the role today of protocols in lieu of governments funding this open source work for kind of taking the internet to the next level?
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. From what I've read and what I've heard from speaking to people, a lot of the internet's early culture comes from research culture. And in research, in academic circles, there's certainly recognition that you have to collaborate, that you have to build on what others have done. Now, there's competitive interests. There's a lot of things that are imperfect about that system, but there is like a deep desire to ensure that the work that you do is used by others and is relevant. I think that, like, fast forwarding right now, we're at a stage right now where we kind of recognize that in order for any of this to be valuable for the world, it has to be useful. It has to be adopted. And I think we recognize that right now, we don't really know what is going to be the best pathway that's going to get there. We need to have a lot of different experiments. And open source is really conducive to there being a lot of experimentation. The idea that you can write something and then anybody can fork it or contribute to it is an incredibly powerful concept. And adding funding into the mix provides this really, really interesting accelerant. Now, that can go both ways. That can lead to people doing all sorts of weird, gaming behavior where they try and optimize for some metric and game the system. But that can also lead to all sorts of really, really interesting outcomes where people from all over the world are able to contribute to some open source project and bring in all sorts of new, unexpected use cases. So I think, like, the internet, again, I might be wrong about like the dates and the facts here, but it probably began largely funded out of a few institutions in the US and Europe, there being a strong culture of research between them, and then it expanding from there. I think with crypto, we're starting from a point where open source is already global. There's already people, millions of people all over the world, in pretty much every country in the world, that is contributing both to, large open source projects and their own little things that are using open source projects. And so we already have that kind of deep desire and need to coordinate effectively. What we don't really have yet is good ways of making sense of all this activity that is happening. It's one thing to look at your own open source project and get a sense for who's contributing and what things you use more often, but to zoom out and take a view of the entire landscape and say, here's all the contributor activity that's happening. Here are some of the dependencies that are most valuable within these networks. Here are the up and coming projects or the contributors that are having outsized value. All this stuff is really new to us, and we're not used to thinking about it beyond, here's my project, here's my team. But the reality is that these days, these networks are global. These networks are very, very informal, so people come and go. And they are incredibly powerful in the sense that they can mobilize hundreds of people very quickly if there's a clear shared goal. So it's a fascinating space, but I don't think our legacy ways of funding these things are well equipped to fund it and to accelerate it in the right ways.
Yeah, I wonder if, so one of the things you mentioned too was this idea of like all of these the protocols that were being built in the early internet days, right?
Yeah.
So I think many of us will be familiar with things like HTTP, TCP, IP, SMTP, all of these different protocols that help the internet just work and make it work.
Right.
One thing that I learned, because one of the first things I did coming right out of college is I went into IT work, right? I was really fascinated by, the way that hardware devices could communicate with one another. And that's the route that I took. Others took software development. Maybe I should have done that. But I went on the hardware route. But, some of it definitely was correlated to, protocols. And one of the things that I learned through that work is that there were standards that were developed, even though there were competing protocols at the time, in order for us to take that next leap forward.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've seen, and to kind of piggyback off of what you said, which is open source allows this like ability, it's the superpower of it, where anyone can fork, the software and kind of iterate and build something of their own. However, I think one of the issues that I've seen, and maybe it's too early to call it an issue, but one of the things that I've seen is that then you have all of these different competing protocols that kind of behave similarly, but don't really talk to one another. What do you think? Where do we stand, I guess, is the first question today in terms of standardizing protocols? And what do you think is needed in order to kind of just develop some of these standards?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think there's like probably two ways of thinking about protocols. So one, there are certain protocols which are just widely adopted, and they become so widely adopted that you no longer have to think about choosing one. There isn't a choice anymore. It's just universal, right? And so obviously, protocols for email, for HTTP and so on are so universally adopted that you would never contemplate having some alternative. At the same time, in like crypto, we refer to any project that has smart contracts as a protocol. And obviously right now there's a lot of competition or choice among those protocols. So I think, they all hope to be some kind of great hyperstructure or ossified system, which everybody's using and doesn't require any ongoing maintenance. But the reality is that most of them right now have active teams and are being developed and so on. So I think there's like a gray area between those two. To get your point about like these larger internet protocols, I think that there's a few features of them which are pretty unique and interesting. And probably the counterintuitive thing about protocols is that in order to build a lasting protocol, you need a person who's going to have a CEO mindset, who's going to have like big vision, who's going to be relentless and do the hard work of getting people to buy into that vision and selling it and having it be adopted and so on, and getting it out in the hands of as many stakeholders and users as possible. But unlike a company where we can list the names of all of the famous CEOs and the people that have built great companies over the year, you can't do that for protocols. You can't actually think of the great protocol leaders of the past 100 years because they do such a good job that the story is no longer them. They have decentralized that role of leadership. They have turned it over to a community. And that's the case because we don't remember their names. And if that person, ideally, it came from one person, you could probably trace that back and figure out who was the person who had the idea or who started it. But they're gone. They vanished from history, and they are not critical to sustaining the protocol. And so it takes a similar type of leadership, but it has to come from a place where your goal is actually to vanish and not be critical to the long-term survival of the protocol. Whereas with a company, you have many CEOs that stay in power for quite some time, and a whole economic system desired to, that's set up to continue that. So I think it's interesting. Like, you need the same people, but they need to go, like, the end state is very, very different.
It takes a different caliber of person to have that type of belief and understand that role, right? Because I think that, like you said earlier, we lost our way from Web 1 to Web 2. Right. And I think part of that is we got celebrity, founders who, that is part of the appeal, I'm sure, for many, is to reach that level of, kind of building something and then walking away.
Right.
So let's go back to open source observer, and maybe we can touch on Hypercerts here. So we've been talking about open source a lot. What is the value in terms of the data that's available through this open source software? Yeah. And what is the role of a project like Open Source Observer in terms of understanding that data?
So I guess the starting point would be that the great thing about open source is that all of the work that a project is doing is out there in the open. You just need to know where to look for it. The great thing about open source combined with crypto is that all of the activity around who is using whatever that project is creating and the financial flows in and out of the project are also there in the public. So traditionally in Web 2, there's obviously lots of valuable open source projects. 76% of the internet runs on open source. So it's huge, it's massive. But there isn't really any way for those open source projects to see how many users are actively, of the apps that import this library or that use this package, how many users do they have? There's no way of being able to see that unless they voluntarily share that information. And similarly, there's no way of seeing how much funding those products are making, or how much revenue they're generating, et cetera. So that link is missing traditionally. And what's really cool about what you have in crypto is that those two things can be connected quite easily, actually. So it is possible to say, here's an open source project, here's the work it is doing, and then separately, you can see, here are all of the users of that project, or here are all the products that are downstream of that and their users. And then finally, if there's grant funding or other sources of income that are coming in on chain, you can add that layer into. So all this is open data. You don't need to get people to voluntarily submit their user data or financials. You can just grab it if you know where to look. And so that's like the really cool thing that is possible uniquely in crypto. And Open Source Observer, we are trying to create a place where you have that linking between a project's work activities and its on-chain footprint. So there's like a massive design space there, but that's like the basic thing that we're trying to do, which would be next to impossible in Web 2, but comes natively out of the box in crypto.
Let's go and talk about Optimism a bit and the work that Open Source Observer has done at Optimism. Because, for anybody who's been tracking the RPGF space or just generally the development of like L2s,
right? I
think it's hard to disagree that Optimism has made a big impact. But it's easy to say that, but it's hard to prove that, I suppose. And so it's in the data, right?
Right.
What is some of the work that you have done over at Optimism to prove the impact of the work that they're doing, whether that be just generally builders on Optimism or through the funding that they have provided through their RPGF rounds?
Yeah, so I would say that we're probably at the stage right now where it's very difficult to prove impact in a rigorous way. There are like leading metrics. So for instance, you can look at developer activity, you can look at different types of user activity, and you can see, are those going up? Are they flatlining, et cetera? And so in those accounts, we've done some reports on Optimism, and you can see that even during the bear market, their developer numbers seemed pretty solid. There were people that were coming in and not only working in the Optimism ecosystem, but actually deploying things and sticking around, and not just like being there for a hackathon and so on. So that's good to see. What I don't have is the ability to like compare that to other ecosystems, or to say, in the absence of whatever they were doing, this grant program, this hackathon, here's what would have happened. That's what's required to show that this is actually having some kind of ROI over and above what might happen if you just let things run their course. The other thing that we're helping Optimism with, which I think is really interesting, is they have these rounds, like you mentioned, of retroactive public goods funding, where they want to look back within a domain and have a set of badge holders allocate funding to the projects that have been most impactful. Now, the last round, which just ended, they got something like 1,500 projects that applied. Massive number, right? You can't be expected to know the ins and outs of 1,500 projects or even which ones are the best ones. From there was like a filtering process. I think like 900 or so didn't meet the requirements, were spam, et cetera. And so you're still left with 600 projects, which is insane, right? Like trying to review 600 projects and make an assessment about how much impact they've had, and then turn that into a recommendation for how much funding they should get is an incredibly difficult problem. And so, what we tried to do during the process was help create some data around what those projects were doing. It was pretty basic. So we could look at, here are the open source projects, here's how many stars they have, here's how many contributors. If they're on chain, here's how much sequencer fees they're generating, here's how many active users. Pretty surface level metrics. But even then, being able to expose that to voters helped, number one, identify like the real strong projects. Those like would clearly stand out. And I think there's also a number of projects that might have been overlooked otherwise, but because you had data in the loop, they were able to get some funding and get some attention. So I think like it's pretty cool to see that happen, that they didn't have to market themselves. They didn't have to try and get in front of all these badge holders, but they could let the data speak to their impact. And that would be a signal that people should give them some funding. So that was like the good part. I think the not so good part is that if you look at the results, I'm not sure how well they would map to where Optimism as a community wants to see impact in the future. So like a lot of the projects that receive a lot of funding are public goods that are very valuable for the broader Ethereum ecosystem, but their impact on Optimism specifically is much harder to quantify. And there was a series of projects that basically went Optimism native. They deployed their first. They channeled all of their attention on growing activity on Optimism, and they felt overlooked. They felt that they didn't receive much more funding and perhaps even less funding than people that were chain agnostic or were doing something completely off chain. So again, I'm in the seat of not really wanting to have a strong opinion about what is good or bad. But I think if you were to hold up a mirror to the voters and say, do you think these projects should get more funding or less funding? They probably would have said, I think they should be getting more funding. And the result was they ended up getting less funding because of how the voting went and so on. So now there's some kind of a correction which is happening, and they're trying to make sure that they're able to draw kind of a clearer signal to these are the things that we want to see more of. And ideally, there can be data that will help you identify which projects are doing the most of that. And then from there, a voting mechanism which allows people to kind of tweak or fine tune specific allocation or the ranking of projects. But ideally, there isn't a question of, is this project on chain or not? Is this project having this many users? You shouldn't have to go and like verify that data yourself. It should be there and used like throughout the voting process.
Yeah, all of those are valuable points. And I think that it's really good to see how Optimism has started to narrow the scope, I suppose, in terms of the way that they retroactively fund. Shameless shill, Mosaic, when I started building that, the idea of it was hugely influenced by the work that Optimism was doing with RPGF, right? Cool. I saw the value of, being able to retroactively reward people based on the value or impact that they've created. However, and this was really how we started to work on the problem, was how can we narrow that a bit more so that it's both easier to measure, but easier to kind of like also look at the impact over time.
Right.
And that was kind of the thesis for us in terms of how we started building that. Now Optimism seems to be kind of catching on to that too, but still I think it's quite broad. So it'll be interesting to see how they continue to kind of riff on this, because it's still early, obviously. But it's good to see so many different projects having gotten rewarded, for the value that they created, and hopefully that they continue to create. So one of the things that I want to talk about specifically about the work that you do over at Oso is, this idea of like data scientists or impact data scientists, as you've talked about it. This seems to be a new or emerging role or job category. What are your thoughts in terms of like where we are now in terms of like how many impact data scientists are available, how we can get there, because I think this also speaks to region learnings, which you're heavily involved with, and I'm, volunteering in as well.
Yeah. And this is something that I'm very passionate about. I'm so grateful that you and Umar and David and Doge and Sardius and Awaki, of course, also share that interest. The reality is, I think right now it's fairly lonely. There aren't a lot of people that are, number one, equipped with the skill set that are able to do data analysis or data science work and care about like the regen or the public goods aspect of it. There's a lot of people that have good data skills, but maybe they're working at hedge funds or they're working doing baseball statistics or marketing, and then you have a lot of regens that are doing good work, or they're designing programs, or they are looking for funding, et cetera. But like the Venn diagram between the two is pretty small, and you can probably count on one hand the number of people that are actually actively building in that area. So that's a problem. I think the goal with Regen Learnings and the data bootcamp that we're working on together, and long term for Open Source Observer, is to like create much more of an overlap between those two sets of people. What that looks like is taking some data scientists and getting them inspired to work on public goods problems and to move out of Web 2 and into Web 3. For the regens, it's giving them a skill set that allows them to start bringing in impact metrics and using data to apply for funding, to track impact, to design better programs, et cetera. So what's really cool about the community is that we're trying to literally work at the intersection of that. And it's going to take a lot of persistence and trial and error to like figure out what's the right mix of learning and inspiring people and letting them learn at their own pace to get there to be more people right now. But the hope would certainly be that 6 months, a year from now, there's actually going to be demand for people that have these kind of data skills and can apply them towards the question of how do we spend treasuries, how do we allocate funding towards impact and better public goods.
What do you foresee as the future opportunities for Web3 if we did a better job? Maybe that's the wrong way of asking it. Just generally leveraging impact data a bit more.
Right.
Because maybe some projects are doing so now, but like you said, there's a lack of impact data scientists. So given the opportunity that there's more people involved in that space, what do you think are some of the opportunities for the space of Web3 as it grows?
I think one of the things which is really unique about this kind of a data problem is that if you're in a traditional organization, you are given the data that matters, right? It is already there in some nice database, and all you have to do is decide, answer a question. The difficult thing that we find in crypto is that basically the design space and the data space is unlimited, and it's always expanding, right? And so a really important skill is being a cartographer, is being able to actually map out the ecosystem, understand what communities are relevant, figure out what data is available about those, where it exists, bringing it on, where it doesn't exist, try and help people create that. It could be through attestations, it could be through hypercerts, it could be through just a simple database replication. But like right now, a lot of the most important work is actually mapping out the ecosystem and getting things connected. Once you do that, then you are actually able to have clean data sets where analysts can come in without much instruction, say, okay, I have an idea. Let me go out and do this. I think Dune has done a really outstanding job democratizing SQL and data analysis, where you can basically see, here's a DeFi protocol, here's the way that they're measuring, TVL or active users or whatever metric. Now let me fork that, swap out the contract address, change the styling, but then now I have a new dashboard for my project. That's really cool. I think we need more of that type of energy and that type of approach happening in the the regen data space.
I think this speaks to, and this is something that you offered in terms of a conversation topic. So maybe we can dive just a little bit more into this. Speaks to the difference between business intelligence and network intelligence, right? Mm-hmm. In terms of if you're working in the traditional data space, you're given the data, the problem, but in a network, you really kind of have to seek that out for yourself. Maybe can you talk a little bit more about like network intelligence overall?
So first, let me start with the business intelligence that we were kind of familiar with. So if you work for like a Web2 startup or any kind of modern enterprise, there will often be like a business intelligence unit or team, right? And these are basically people that are kind of working with marketing. They're working with, sales teams. They are looking at operational data, and they have access to this like, massive data warehouse. And then they're able to run analytics software on top of that. It could be Tableau, Looker, Metabase. There's a variety of tools that are out there. And so this is like, 20 years ago, this didn't exist. And now it's a huge job category. And basically, every company has some equivalent of a business intelligence function. Now, in crypto, there's obviously a similar set of questions that people might have, which is, where are the users coming from and how long are they staying and what are they doing? But that capability does not exist right now. It doesn't make sense for you to just go and look on Etherscan to get a sense of where your users are coming from. It's very difficult to do that. And at the same time, because these are decentralized networks, the contours of who is contributing and where they're coming from and what is like a participant is always changing. You don't have the ability to have a budget and say, we're going to deploy money for this product and, give this team more funding, et cetera. In an open source network, that's always changing over time. And so the goal really is to figure out what is the equivalent of, metrics that you care about in a network. How do you create an environment where, the data is always changing, but you can motivate and incentivize people to contribute new models, new metrics, connect new data sources. And then instead of having your own, business intelligence team or a set of data analysts, you actually have a network, which is motivated to do that, which is going to be contributing things that they care about, but they're also, valuable for the network. And ideally, this is a job. It's not volunteer work, but they're able to get compensated for that. I think those are like the problems that exist. We're trying to build a stack for network intelligence. It's entirely open source. All the data is open, and even the infrastructure for people to contribute and use it is fully open as well, because we want to remove as many barriers as possible for people to do this type of impact data science, and as many networks as possible to take advantage of that.
So one of the problems that I've seen with, I guess, determining impact is the fact that sometimes these same, metrics are being gamed, right? So someone identifies how value is being determined, and they go and kind of fake or they add noise to that data set. What do you think is kind of something we can do when it comes to trying to understand impact through the data so that we can, better measure that? Or is that just impossible?
Yeah, so there's a thing called Goodhart's law, which basically says any I forget the exact terming of it, but like any metric that exists once it is stated to be a metric will be gamed and will cease to be a useful metric. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. I don't think that we should just be cynical and say that it's not worth trying, because over time, many industries have had the same kind of problem, right? Which is that they start with a metric, it's not particularly useful, and that leads them to search for better metrics, as opposed to giving up and saying, let's actually just give up on this and go back to not having any data. There's a good example that we use from like baseball and Moneyball. So back in the day, you had all of these scouts that would go and they would look at baseball players and they would say, okay, like how do we pick the best players? Well, we look for the biggest ones. We look for the ones that hit the most home runs and stuff like that. And for like 50 years, you had this class of experts that would have their own secret formula for figuring out who was the strongest baseball player. And every team was paying as much money as they could to get those limited set of players that they thought were the best. And then there was a data revolution where they said, actually, those metrics are not very useful. They're not very predictive of how a team is going to perform. There's a whole set of other metrics which are much better. And we can use those to design a team which is just as good at a fraction of the cost. Now, of course, once one team starts doing that, other teams start copying it, and the level raises for everyone. But I think there's something similar here, which is possible for open source networks, where right now we can all look at the metrics that exist, and accept that they are at best a good indication of popularity and how long a product has been around and how credible it is. But they're not very good at helping us identify up and coming talent or identifying projects that are really, really important but are underappreciated or underrecognized. It's not very good at that. And so what we need to do now is actually start searching for better metrics that can help us identify those types of things. And I think the more we can be specific about, here's an area of impact that we care about, here's a set of projects that we want to be able to discover through this, we'll be able to design much more targeted metrics, as opposed to saying, let's just try and come up with a better metric that can be useful for any use case, any network. So being very specific, like if this is DeFi, saying, okay, here are the things that are we care a lot about in the case of DeFi, and being incredibly detail oriented about what that metric is and where it might come from. Now, even then, you're still going to have some metrics which are better than others, and there will be some which are easier and harder to game. But I think that's like the iteration that we have to do here. It's not a reason to give up. It's a reason to actually think hard about this, be hypothesis driven, be ready to throw things out if they don't yield results. Expect that most impact metrics will not be that useful, but it's like this is a long-term goal. We're not going to solve it overnight.
Yeah, I completely agree. One of the things that I've been very excited to see over the course of the year, which is quite interesting actually, to see how much development was happening during a bear cycle. But I guess that's just generally actually how it works. Yeah. The signal does come through the noise because there's very little noise. So if you're really paying attention and you're involved, you can see a lot of the ways that the ecosystem is moving forward much more clearly.
Yeah.
One of the things that I, personally got really involved in was Farcaster.
Yeah.
I really have enjoyed seeing how the ecosystem is moving forward through kind of like the social movement, because they've, the team over there has built a really wonderful product, and they continue to iterate to make things possible in a Web3 native way, but making it very familiar and friendly. What are your thoughts in terms of like the role, decentralized social, or maybe some other kind of vertical in the Web3 space will help to continue to elevate the value of the impact that we make across the ecosystem?
I agree. I think it's a huge contribution. It's also, again, I wasn't like involved in data analysis at this time, but I think circa 2009 and so when Twitter was just getting started, they had an open API. There was a whole class of people that were really interested in doing network graph analysis and coming up with their own curation algorithms and stuff like that. And they all obviously went off and did other things once Twitter nerfed people and took away the API access. But there's just a tremendous amount of data available through the Farcaster social graph, and we're just beginning to glimpse the possibilities that enables. Everything from getting public goods that are curated by your friends or Gitcoin grant recommendations, to being able to see which NFTs you might like, to being able to I think those are kind of skeuomorphic examples that we are familiar with because we're crypto natives. But if you were to think beyond that, there's all sorts of things that are going to open up that we can't even imagine now, just because you can have a social graph and you can layer financial activity on top of that. I guess I'm most excited right now about being able to add some layer of developer, linking developers to Farcaster IDs and getting a sense for what, if you take the question of what public goods do we care most about, I would love to be able to get a graph of here are developers that have contributed on an open source project, and here's their social graph on Farcaster. And then through that, get some sense of what public goods might be most impactful to them, what DeFi protocols they tend to prefer, how that has changed over time, et cetera. Those types of possibilities simply don't exist in Web 2. We're still very early, but you can start to glimpse the possibilities that are emerging just by having those two data sets imminently discoverable.
Yeah, that's amazing. When you think about the power of leveraging the social graph in open source software, I think that's a really interesting one.
And even, there's the age-old problem around, Sybil attacks and so on. I think that a lot of the attack vectors begin on social media, right? Well, there will be influencers who say, hey, everyone, come and sign up for this airdrop or do these actions and you will get this thing. Being able to look at these actions that show up on chain and then trace that to certain patterns of activity on Farcaster or other sources of social media will be really powerful and becoming more resistant to those types of attacks or trying to game the incentive.
100%. Well, as we are close to reaching the top of the hour, I just want to make sure, is there anything else that you think we needed to cover that we haven't yet covered?
I know we covered this before, but the thing that I will shill again is that we are really looking to grow the concept of the impact data scientist and the person who's able to develop a set of data skills and apply them to the question of how do we get better at funding public goods. So if that speaks to you, if that's something that you want to contribute to, please reach out. My DMs are open. You can go to opensource.observer. You can find more about what we're building. You can see our docs there. You can learn about ways of getting data. You can join the community that we have on Discord and in Telegram. We'd love to get you up to speed, show you how to start grabbing data and making sense of it. So that's like the most immediate call to action. We're also doing an event in San Francisco on April 13th and 14th. It's called Funding the Commons. It's a wonderful event where you get people from academia, from Web3, from the traditional Web2 and startup world to gather together. It'll be in Berkeley, California. They'll be talking about open source one day and AI the second day. So very important topics. And we'd love more people to come and sign up. So you can go to fundingthecommons.io to get information about that.
Amazing. Thank you for putting that on my radar. I don't know how I missed that, but I definitely will be up there.
Awesome. Yeah, that'd be great to see you, Humpty.
Yeah, for me, it's a quick drive up, right? So I have no excuse, really. So where can people connect with you personally? I know we know now how to get started on Open Source Observer, but how can people find you, whether that be Web2, Web3, social, or somewhere else?
Yeah, so I'm on Farcaster. You can find me there. I'm also on Twitter. My personal website, which links to some of my writing and has links to other things that will help you get in touch with me. So yeah, those are probably the best places.
Awesome. Well, Carl, I'm hugely grateful for the time you've given us. And I've learned so much and am inspired again on my journey of open data and Web3.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Humpty. It's been, for me, like really inspiring getting to know you over the past couple of years, seeing all that you've done, before and throughout the bear market, and specifically how we're working together in Regen Learnings and building, a group of new data analysts. It's really important work. And so thank you so much for being there and working on that directly with me and others.
Absolutely. And if we didn't drop the website for people to get started, what's the website for that specifically?
Yeah, go to regenlearnings.xyz.
There we go. All right. Thank you, everybody.
All right. See ya.